the latest. Thank you for your love and support. I appreciate you all. Those who are sending me super thanks, I say thank you. The president of France, Emmanuel Macron, claims Africa is his continent and his home. According to him, Africa belongs to him. Yes, we know France was our colonial master, but these people are still dreaming. To date, they still think that Africa is theirs. Even though we have our sovereignty, maybe to him, we are just independent on paper, and that is why they are still having control over everything that we do, the kind of leaders that we should have, what should transpire, education, the food, and everything. They still sit there and decide what they want to happen in Africa. And that is why when we have Mali, Niger, and Burkina Faso that have reason to say no to this kind of oppression, they still send people after them. We know what happened to Muammar Gaddafi, Thomas Sankara, and all the leaders who rose up to fight for our total freedom. These people claim ownership of everything that has to do with Africa, our mineral resources, and anything in Africa they think belongs to them. And I don't blame them, because our leaders have given them the mandate. They've allowed them for centuries to keep doing whatsoever that they want in the African continent. They dictate to them what they want to be done, and it is done. So if people sit elsewhere to determine what you should do and you do exactly that, why won't they say they owe you? And why should Macron think this way at the first place? Why does he still think that Africa is his? Africa is for the African. Africa is not for anybody. No. So that's the latest around the world. And in France.
L'Afrique est mon continent et ma maison. L'Afrique est mon continent et ma maison.
Africa is my continent and my home. These were the words recently proclaimed by French President Emmanuel Macron, sparking waves of anger, frustration, and disbelief across Africa and among its allies worldwide. But what did he mean by this? Macron made this surprising remark during a recent joint session of the Moroccan parliament. His speech, full of aspirations for closer Franco-Moroccan relations, highlighted France's intention to remain close to Africa. But many saw it as a thinly veiled message, a warning that France isn't ready to let go of its historical claim over Africa. Africa is my continent and my home isn't just a phrase. It symbolizes a colonial relationship that, in Macron's words, seems everlasting. Think about this for a moment. While African countries have fought and struggled for decades to achieve political freedom and economic independence, Macron's words suggest a lingering, almost paternalistic view. It's as if he's saying, you might be independent, but don't forget who you belong to. But Africa is not France's home. Africa belongs to Africans. Perception that Africa's role is to be a provider, a loyal partner, or even a subordinate. In recent years, we've witnessed a powerful wave of resistance from former French colonies in Africa. Mali, Niger, and Burkina Faso, forming the Alliance of Sahel States, AES, are at the forefront of this pushback. They're not just calling for political independence, they're demanding complete economic freedom and control over their resources. These countries are actively taking steps to rid themselves of foreign control, especially from France. The AES has taken bold actions to dismantle the remnants of French influence. In Niger, for example, the government took control of its uranium industry, which for decades had been dominated by French companies. Uranium is one of the world's most valuable resources, and France's dependence on Niger's uranium is well documented. It's essential for France's nuclear power supply. By reclaiming its uranium industry, Niger sent a clear message. Africa will no longer allow its resources to be siphoned off without fair compensation. Meanwhile, in Burkina Faso, President Ibrahim Traoré has made similar strides, taking control of local industries that were once dominated by foreign corporations. Traoré's administration has also established policies that redirect revenue from resource extraction directly into local development projects, benefiting the people instead of foreign shareholders. And let's not forget Mali. The Malian government expelled French troops, closed French military bases, and is actively pursuing new security partnerships that align more closely with its values and interests. The days of automatically calling on France for military support are over. For these countries, relying on foreign military forces has only led to more instability. They've realized that true security will only come when they control their own defenses and safeguard their resources for the benefit of their own people. To understand Macron's statement fully, we need to revisit history. France's involvement in Africa dates back to the late 19th century, during the so-called Scramble for Africa. French colonial rule was brutal, extracting labor, resources, and wealth to fuel French industries and wealth back home. Africa was not seen as a continent of sovereign nations, but as a vast resource bank that France could control and exploit. Even after African nations gained independence in the 1960s, France maintained a stronghold through economic and military agreements. One of the most notorious tools of French influence was the CFA franc, a currency controlled by the French treasury and used by 14 African countries. The CFA franc effectively tethered these countries to France's economy, ensuring that African countries remained financially dependent on France, even though they were supposedly independent. Furthermore, France established military bases across Africa and signed defense pacts that allowed it to station troops in its former colonies. While these were framed as security measures, they ultimately served to reinforce French dominance. So here we are, decades after independence, and France still holds sway over African economies, resources, and in some cases, politics. After all these years, many Africans feel that France views them as nothing more than a source of cheap labor, resources, and influence. The alliance of Sahel states represents a beacon of hope for a future where African nations no longer have to answer to foreign powers. In Burkina Faso, President Ibrahim Traoré is leading the charge, embodying the spirit of resistance that many Africans have longed to see. Traoré's actions have been bold, dismissing French troops and prioritizing national industries and economic independence. Traoré isn't alone. Leaders in Mali and Niger have taken similar steps, forming alliances within the Sahel region to build a coalition strong enough to counteract foreign intervention. This new alliance is about more than just economic policies. It's about forging a future where African nations can decide their own destinies without interference. But let's be clear, this resistance doesn't come without challenges. For years, African leaders who opposed foreign influence were marginalized or overthrown. Leaders like Thomas Sankara, who dreamed of a self-sufficient Africa, were often met with hostility from the West. Today's leaders, like Traoré, are reigniting this dream, but the path forward is not without obstacles. Back in France, Macron's stance on Africa is not without its own critics. Many French citizens and political figures argue that Macron's approach to Africa is outdated and unsustainable. They question why France continues to intervene in African affairs, why it insists on maintaining military bases, and why it holds such control over African economies. Some French critics believe France should shift to a relationship built on mutual respect and economic partnership, allowing African nations to truly govern themselves. Macron's government, however, seems torn between these progressive voices and those who cling to the belief that France has a duty, or perhaps a right, to remain involved in Africa. There's an internal struggle within France about how best to relate to Africa. This debate is more than just political. It's also moral. Macron's critics argue that it's time for France to let go of its ownership mentality. Africa does not belong to France, and treating it as such is a denial of African sovereignty. Yet Macron's recent statements suggest that he believes in maintaining this historical connection. For many Africans, the West represents a constant reminder of exploitation and extraction. From the Nigerian uranium that powers French homes to the cocoa in Côte d'Ivoire used in European chocolate, Africa's resources have enriched the West while leaving Africans in poverty. Nigerians have long voiced frustrations over oil extraction practices that benefit Western companies but pollute local waters and deprive communities of wealth. In Congo, the extraction of cobalt, a mineral essential for modern electronics, fuels the global tech industry, while Congolese people live in poverty. In many ways, Africa has been a silent partner in the success of Western economies, providing raw materials without seeing the profits trickle back. This disparity fuels resentment and is one of the core reasons for the rising anti-Western sentiment in Africa. For many, it feels like a modern form of colonialism, dressed up in the language of business and development. When Macron says, "Africa is my continent and my home," many Africans hear, "Africa is mine to control." But Africa has its own dreams, aspirations, and future to build, a future that doesn't require foreign oversight. Today, the Pan-African movement is stronger than ever, with leaders from the AES nations like Ibrahim Traoré championing a vision for Africa where Africans are the decision-makers. The AES has become a symbol of resistance, standing united to ensure that Africa's future is shaped by Africans, not dictated by foreign interests. The actions of the AES nations have inspired a sense of hope and unity across the continent. People are realizing the power of collective action. African unity is no longer just a dream. It's a reality taking shape across borders. This movement goes beyond political alliances. It's a cultural, economic, and social revolution. Africans are reclaiming their narratives, industries, and resources. The Sahel nations have demonstrated that African countries can collaborate to secure a future where they stand as equals in the global arena.